We're honored to welcome our guest scholar, Matti Friedman, to the Bima to share remarks this morning. Matti is a journalist and award-winning author of 4 books of nonfiction, including Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel, Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier's Story of a Forgotten War, and his most recent book, Who by Fire, Leonard Cohen in the Sinai, listed by both Vanity Fair and Mosaic Magazine as one of their top books of 2022 and being made into a limited TV dramatic series. A former Associated Press correspondent, Matti's work as a reporter has taken him from Israel to Lebanon, Morocco, Moscow, the Caucasus, and Washington, D.C. 2 critical essays he wrote about media coverage of Israel after the 2014 Gaza war for Tablet and then The Atlantic triggered intense discussion, having been shared on Facebook more than 130,000 times. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, Smithsonian, and so many other places. Please join me in welcoming Matti Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for that unique and deeply moving service. I'm disappointed that the musicians disappeared because I was hoping for some musical accompaniment during my talk, kind of Letterman style, but I guess that's not to be. We find ourselves on Parashat Beshalach, as we do every year, standing at the Red Sea at a moment of intense violence and chaos. The imperial cavalry, which we expected to slaughter every man, woman, and child fleeing Egypt, has just been drowned in the sea in an unexpected miracle. We've just been through plagues and moments of fear and death and destruction, and we're facing an uncertain journey ahead through the desert. It's a long road to Canaan, as they know, and we don't know how long it's going to take, and we don't know how we're going to get there, and we know that there's a hostile tribe waiting for us just over the next hill, and another one beyond the hill, beyond that. And it's at that moment that Moshe chooses to sing. And I've read the text of Shirat Hayam, of the Song of the Sea, countless times over the years. And this time what struck me was not the incredibly flowery Hebrew of Shirat Hayam, it's just this absolutely incredible biblical Hebrew. Shir al Adonai ki ga'o ga'a, sus verochvo rama vayam. It's just, even if you don't understand the words, it sounds like music, but what caught my eye this time was the simplest word in the whole song, and also the first word, which is az. Az yashir Moshe. Az means then, or at that moment. The Torah doesn't set it up as it usually does by saying vayashir Moshe. In the Haftarah, the prophet Dvorah starts to sing, and it says vatashir Dvorah. That's usually how it starts, but here it uses a different formulation, az yashir Moshe. Precisely at this moment, Moshe decides to sing. It's at a moment of chaos and uncertainty that we need words, and that we need a leader who can stand up in front of the people and tell us a story about who we are and where we're going and what our relationship with God is. Az Yashir Moshe. And that's what he does in the Song of the Sea. And to a greater extent, that's what Moshe does for us as a people. He tells us the story of who we are. And we call it the 5 books of Moses, Torat Moshe. It's in the books in the Aron behind me, and it's that story that allows us to get not only from Egypt to Canaan, but to get from the land of Israel and beyond to the many stations that we've been through in Jewish history, all the way to Park Avenue. So the power of a story at the right time in our tradition is very, very great. I just came in from Israel, which is where I live. I live in Jerusalem. I think, or you have some sense of what Israel is like right now. The first thing that I did as a journalist after October 7th, after took me about a week just to kind of get my bearings and begin to function again, was travel to a kibbutz called Mishmar HaEmek, which is in northern Israel. Mishmar HaEmek is not connected to the events of October 7th, but Mishmar HaEmek was housing evacuees from a different kibbutz called Nachal Oz. Nachal Oz is a very small kibbutz on the border with Gaza, just a few hundred yards from the fence. And people from Nachal Oz, the survivors from Nachal Oz, had been moved north to Mishmar HaEmek, and I met them there. The kids from Nachal Oz were being entertained in the dining hall by volunteers who had showed up to just keep everyone going. Someone had brought snakes. A guy was doing a snake show for the kids. So inside the dining hall were kind of squeals of delight and laughter and kids just being kids as they were entertained by these snakes. And their parents were outside the dining hall sitting in this courtyard with hollow eyes, kind of ashen faces. And I spoke to them, and the stories that they told me, we've become accustomed to hearing them now that more than 3 months have passed. But this was a week later, and we still weren't used to these stories. And these were stories that seemed to be drawn from a different period of Jewish history. There were people my age, Israelis my age, with kids the same age as my kids, young children, teenagers, and they were telling me stories that seemed to be drawn from Poland in 1943, from Kishinev in 1903, from medieval Germany in the year 1200, stories about people hiding in closets, and stories about kids hiding under beds, stories about fighting over the door handle, being inside a room with your family, with people trying to break into the room to kill you, people holding down the door handle with terrorists on the other side trying to open it. This is a repeated story from October 7th. It's so common, tragically, that it actually is a genre of storytelling with its own name. We call it Hakrav al-Hayadit, the battle for the doorknob, because it happens so many times. We know the versions of the story where the people inside the room manage to hold the handle down and stay safe. We don't hear the many instances where they failed to hold the handle down and the outcome was different. So I was hearing these stories that seemed to be taken from the history of the Jewish people before 1948. That everything we thought we'd achieved after 1948, everything we thought was safe after 1948, proved or felt to be illusory. And we were suddenly in a different story, in a different time, in a different period of Jewish history. And I drove back from interviewing the people from Nachal Oz, and this was a week or so into the war, and it was at a time when our own leadership had gone silent. Israelis were not being told a story about what was going on. The government had been shocked into silence and dysfunction. And there was an incredible grassroots mobilization, as we discussed last night, because Israelis are magicians at just pulling things together at a moment of crisis. But there was no leader, as there was on the Red Sea, facing the people and saying, listen, folks, this is what's going on. As Yashir Moshe, we had nothing. We had no one giving us any direction. And I was driving back to Jerusalem after speaking to these people from Nachal Oz, and I remembered why Nachal Oz was ringing a bell. Very little of any importance has ever happened at Nachal Oz. It's a very small place. And until October 7th, many Israelis had never even heard of Nachal Oz. The most famous thing that happened at Nachal Oz happened in 1956. And it was the delivery of one of the great Zionist speeches. This happens the day after a member of Nachal Oz named Ro'i Rothberg, this young guy in his early 20s, was in the fields of Nachal Oz. The kibbutz had been set up a few years before. It was on the border with Gaza, but there was no fence. It was just a furrow. The border was just a furrow in the field, and the Israelis were tilling until the last furrow, which is classically the Zionist approach, which might not survive the current war, but that's what they were doing. Ro'i was out in the field. When people came over the border from Gaza, they killed him, took him back to Gaza. Eventually, the body was returned, and the kibbutz holds a funeral, and Moshe Dayan shows up. And Moshe Dayan at that time was 40 years old. Moshe Dayan, for the younger members of the audience, is the the one with the eye patch. He was the chief of staff of the army at that time. And he shows up at Nachal Oz, and he wants to say something. And I'm just going to read you part of what he said. It's a very short eulogy, and I'm abridging it further. I'm just going to read a part of it because I think it evokes many thoughts, sometimes radically different thoughts for different people. So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to let you decide. And Moshe Dayan here, I think, is entering the Jewish tradition of leaders speaking at the right time. Right? We have leaders like Dvorah from the Haftarah. There's a battle against the Canaanites. It's a scary moment. So Dvorah and Barak ben Avinoam, they sing a song to the people. They give a speech. They recite a poem that reassures people of the nature of our story. The expert at this, King David. David is a warrior, of course. He's a great soldier, but he's also a musician and a poet, and he is constantly breaking into song. So he'll win a battle, and then he will sing a song, and he wrote so many songs that they're all over our own prayer book, and many of our prayers to this day have his byline on them. Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David. Whether or not he actually wrote it is beside the point. We believe that he did. There is a history of Jewish leaders showing up and finding the words. We'll be discussing another one, by the way, later this afternoon. Leonard Cohen is not exactly a Jewish leader, but he is a great Jew, or was, and he showed up in the middle of the Yom Kippur War at one of the darkest moments in Israel's history, maybe the darkest until now. And he showed up at a moment where he'd given up on his own art. He thought he couldn't sing anymore. He'd announced that he was retiring. He was kind of at the end of his rope. And he came to the Sinai front in the Yom Kippur War and had a series of very disturbing experiences, at the end of which he could sing again. And he wrote new songs that we sing in some instances to this day in synagogue. One of them is Who by Fire, written immediately after the war. And he goes on, of course, to write Hallelujah, which Cantor Davis brought so beautifully into the liturgy this morning. In some indirect way, that's a result of what happens to Leonard Cohen in the war. He finds the word. So Moshe Dayan shows up at this kibbutz, and this is what he says. Yesterday at daybreak, Ro'i was murdered. The quiet of a spring morning blinded him, and he didn't see the people lurking behind the furrow. Let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years have they sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once lived. Not from the Arabs of Gaza must we demand the blood of Ro'i, Dayan says, but from ourselves. How did our eyes close to the reality of our fate, unwilling to see the destiny of our generation in its full cruelty? Have we forgotten that this small band of youths at Nachal Oz carries on its shoulders the heavy gates of Gaza, beyond which hundreds of thousands of eyes and arms huddle together and pray for the onset of our weakness, so that they may tear us to pieces? Have we forgotten? We are a generation of settlement, and without the steel helmet and the cannon, we shall not plant a tree or build a house. Our children will not have lives to live if we do not dig shelters, and without the barbed wire fence and the machine gun, we will not pave a path or drill for water. Millions of Jews, annihilated because they had no land, peer out at us from the ashes of the history of Israel and command us to settle and rebuild a land for our people. But beyond the furrow that marks the border lies a surging sea of hatred and vengeance, yearning for the day that the tranquility blunts our alertness, for the day that we heed the ambassadors of hypocrisy who call on us to lay down our arms. It is to us that the blood of Ro'i calls from his body. Although we have vowed 1,000 vows that our blood will never be shed in vain, yesterday we were once again seduced, brought to listen, and to believe. Ro'i Rothberg, the thin blonde youth who left Tel Aviv to build his home by the gates of Gaza, to serve as our wall. Ro'i, the light in his heart blinded his eyes, and he never saw the flash of the knife. It's a eulogy that inspires many thoughts, one of which is that it could have been written last week, and it was written in 1956. It's also true that we have no leaders who could speak to us like that, not in my country and not in this country. The ability to speak the truth, even though it's uncomfortable, the ability not to pander to what people want, which is revenge, and say, no, it's not their problem, it's our problem. And the question is not who they are, the question is what we are going to do. And it's not a song exactly, but it's poetry, and it's full of biblical allusion, which is more clear in the Hebrew than it is in the English. The gates of Gaza, that's the story of Shimshon from the book of Judges, Samson, and the flash of the knife in Hebrew, hu lo ra'a et brak hama'achelet. And in Hebrew, when we say ma'achelet, that's not the usual word for knife. That's supposed to remind us of the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. That's the ma'achelet. Hu lo ra'a et brak hama'achelet. So it's poetry, and it's one of those great coincidences that the man speaking is named Moshe, Az Yashir Moshe. Without leadership that can speak to us and tell us a story and tell us where we're going to get lost in the desert. We could drown instead of our enemies. If we find the words and if we find the kind of leadership that we need, a kind of leadership that can tell us a story and take us forward, and as has happened many times throughout our history, then we will stand on the banks of the Red Sea and make it safely across. Shabbat Shalom.